we heard from two digital therapeutics companies that are literally changing the health of individuals right before our eyes. This newer field of digital medicine is weaving its way into so many areas of unmet needs. Our next presentation takes you on a journey into the brain to see how, and to see how Learning Corp is changing the trajectory for those with traumatic brain injuries. I'd like to welcome to the stage, you guys can call him up, Dr. Joseph Smith, the Executive Chairman of the Learning Corps, and joining him is Mark Lindsay from the U.S. State Department.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Well, thanks for staying around. I can't wait to see what I'm going to say, and I'll just tell you in advance that Mark's going to steal the show. But I appreciative of the hour. I think you'll find the presentation a little bit jazzy, and so that's not my typical. But I wanted to make sure here we are in Vegas that it at least lived up to some expectations. Let's see how this goes. We'll see. So there's audio that goes with that. Thanks. So in 2012, a tragic accident involved Lauren and her family, and she lost some members of her family, but she also lost important function. She had a traumatic brain injury, which deprived her of many of her cognitive skills. As she progressed in her recovery, largely her physical recovery, her father grew quite impatient as her visible injuries were gradually recovering, but her speech, language, and cognitive therapies were really quite slow. And what he noted, which is what many people note who are struggling with this, is their time with skilled speech, language, and cognitive therapists is really quite limited. It can be an hour a day, 3 days a week, and it may not last very long. And so her dad was always a do everything, maximize everything you can kind of a guy, and he looked around in Boston to see if there was any opportunity to improve the amount of time his daughter could spend with appropriate speech language therapy. And he came upon a research effort together with a small startup in Boston. The university was Boston University, and the startup was called Constant Therapy. And what they had done is taken all of the skills and tasks that speech and language therapists take their patients through and provided them on a digital framework that would allow them to be used wherever and whenever patients could get to them. So in some way, it was a way of liberating the experience of speech and language cognitive therapy to patients so that they could do it on their own time frame. And so Lauren worked hard at it. She gradually recovered the ability to tell time and then progressively improved to where she could recover most of the function she had lost. This graphically reflects the notion that the brain is healing. In fact, the physical attributes of the brain don't heal very much, but the neuroplasticity that's present in the recovering brain can be reprogrammed and rewired with sufficient practice. But importantly, I think what her father noted was that no one gets better from therapy they don't do. And so if you can give people tools so that they can perform their own therapy in an engaging way, that you could expect that kind of recovery. But what this shows is that while she was getting better, Paul across town had a stroke. And Paul, a middle-aged fella, found himself with a stroke that damaged the left frontal and parietal regions of his brain. Paul was losing the ability to speak, and he wanted to maintain his independence. And so he was looking for something to do. He also ran across the team at Constant Therapy, and after a little bit became patient number 334 in a clinical trial looking at the impact of this form of automatic speech, language, and cognitive therapy would have on him. Again, it's the opportunity to take advantage of the neuroplasticity that occurs after injury and stays there as a viable opportunity to take advantage of for up to a couple years. And that, unfortunately, speech and language therapists typically tend to patients for weeks or perhaps months. And so the opportunity winds up being lost. And so what is this thing, Constant Therapy? Constant Therapy was developed by a professor at BU who was a speech and language therapist, together with her husband, who's an engineer. And they said, you know what? There is a tremendous mismatch we watch as almost 1 million people have strokes in this country. 2.5 million people every year in this country have traumatic brain injuries. And there are only about 100,000 speech and language therapists. And the opportunity for improvement can persist for years. And the opportunity to practice is every day. And yet, the actual opportunity that patients are exposed to for recovery is a tiny fractions of the opportunity for improvement that they could have. Which means that the overwhelming majority of patients are left with more disability than would be necessary. And so they decided to take the entire compendium of exercises that were available in the literature, digitize them, and then do something really smart. Once it's on a digital platform, you can measure everything that happens in terms of the patient's engagement with that. So you can begin to tease out the difference between attention versus short-term memory, or latency in terms of initiating a thought versus the kind of the tardive effects of injury on the speed with which you can move your hand. And so if you pay attention to all of the details, you can begin to subspeciate out what's really wrong with someone, what's really the thing you need to work on. And then if you're really good, you can understand that you can look at the 100,000 or so of these exercises and pick out the very next one that a patient needs to be challenged to move along in the areas of their deficits. And so that's what constant therapy is. Developed to be a dynamic program that meets patients where they are, and then that we can learn from it so that eventually we can determine really how patients learn. This was initially developed for therapists to use with their patients, for those suffering from traumatic brain injury or from stroke, cerebrovascular accidents, but it turns out it's found utility in places outside of those more typical forms of brain injury, and for that I'm going to introduce Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Jill. As Jill and Joe said, my name is Mark Lindsay. I'm in the U.S. Foreign Service. Why did I join the Foreign Service? I certainly didn't join for the money, I can tell you that right now. I actually joined because of that flag right there. That flag belonged to my grandfather, who was in World War II. He actually landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. And he had that flag. He gave that flag to me, and in the Foreign Service I've probably been to more than 70 countries. Most of those countries I brought that flag to, where I served. Places like Iraq, Afghanistan, that's been in rocket attacks, places like Chad. But one place that I actually brought that flag was 2 years ago when my wife and I and 2 kids, we call it PCS in the military or in the diplomatic corps, it stands for Permanent Change of Station, when we went to China. And when we went to China, not that long after we got there for a 2-year tour, we heard this sound. This is a replication of the sound that we heard in our apartment, always in the same spot, always over our son's crib. So that sound, as weird as that is, I probably heard it on, I heard it on multiple occasions, and my wife did too. After we heard that sound, I didn't have pain at the time, but shortly after, both my wife and I began feeling lightheaded, and we were having headaches a lot. And we were also having sleep issues too. We ascribed that to the horrible smog that was in, still is, in Guangzhou. We thought, oh, it must be the smog, this is why we don't really feel that right. Our kids had really bad bloody noses, both my son and my daughter. Sometimes it would soak the sheets in the crib, but we also ascribed that to the smog in Guangzhou. What I couldn't ascribe the smog to in Guangzhou was short-term memory loss. And that was of significant concern for both me and my wife, because that isn't something, like I said, that we could just say, oh, that's because of the smog. I knew that something else was going on there. I was forgetting tool names. I was forgetting, I have to have a lot of codes in my head to get through the consulate, especially secret and confidential areas of the consulate in Guangzhou. And I was having trouble recalling simple codes that I didn't have a problem with. Another example is simple tool names that I would use on a daily basis. I just couldn't recall those tools. And inside I was really concerned that I might have early onset of Alzheimer's. One of my grandfathers, not this one, but another one who served actually in the Pacific, he was one of the first people to go to the Pacific after Pearl Harbor was bombed, had early onset of Alzheimer's. As a matter of fact, he was diagnosed around 48 years of age. And at that time, they didn't even have the term Alzheimer's. They told my grandmother that, oh, this is a modified Parkinson's, we're not really sure. So when I was in Guangzhou and forgetting these common tool names, forgetting codes that I used on a daily basis, I was really concerned that I had early onset of Alzheimer's. It turns out that I didn't have early onset of Alzheimer's. State Department medical doctors flew out and they assessed me and my wife. They put us through hours of testing and they medevaced us back to University of Pennsylvania, UPenn. And there, doctors put us through another dozens of hours of testing, MRIs, vestibular tests, things like this. And I was formally diagnosed with a concussion, mild traumatic brain injury. But my mild traumatic brain injury did not come from a blow to the head.
U.S. agencies are investigating, but Mark Lindsay has a theory.
This was a directed standoff attack against my apartment.
It was a weapon,
Of course it was a weapon.
an energy weapon.
Absolutely.
What sort of energy is this that we're talking about?
I believe it's RF, radio frequency energy, in the microwave range.
So microwave weapons are not some futuristic sci-fi thriller that, made up. They're actually quite common, and they've been used. The Soviets actually perfected this technology way back in the 70s. I was born actually in 1974, and my daughter always reminds me how old that is, actually. So this is not new technology. A lot of times you'll read press articles that, oh, this is some new technology that was used against these diplomats, both in China, with my colleagues in China, and there's 26 diplomats from Cuba as well. Doctors found at UPenn and in New York City that my hippocampus in my brain, through MRIs, was disproportionately damaged, and along with other regions of my brain near the hippocampus as well. The hippocampus and regions surrounding the hippocampus are known, you can read scientific journals, you can talk to neurologists about this, for being especially prone or being, let's say, more sensitive to RF, to radio frequency energy in the microwave range. There's all kinds of testing on humans, actually, that the Soviets have done, but on rats as well, and animals like that show damage to the hippocampus. The other thing that I should stress, too, in all of this, when you read press accounts about what happened to my colleagues in Cuba and what happened to me in China, this is not some sonic attack that people refer to them as sonic attacks. They're not. What they were is RF, radio frequency attacks to us. So when I was back at UPenn, they tried to prepare me delicately. They said, you're going to have a hard time with this recovery based on your colleagues in Cuba. You're going to need to do cognitive therapy. I resisted that. I said, I don't need speech therapy. I don't need cognitive therapy. And they said, yes, you do. And they had me work with a fantastic speech pathologist, speech therapist, if you will, near Boston. And she recommended constant therapy to me. I've had fantastic results with constant therapy. It's an app on your phone that you can download. It's very easy to download. And what it's done for me has been profound. It's taken my cognitive scores that were very low level, so much so that State Department, the Foreign Service, revoked my medical clearance, so I couldn't serve overseas. When I couldn't serve overseas, I was devastated because that's the whole reason I joined the Foreign Service. They revoked my clearance so I could just serve domestically. Because of my work with constant therapy, I've got my cognitive scores now back to a level where my medical clearance has been reinstated. So that's really been not only a career saver, but constant therapy has been a lifesaver for me as well.
So I told you he would steal the show, right? So for Lauren, who was our first patient in traumatic brain injury, she's now back at school, back at college. Paul is still living independently and uses constant therapy every day. And you've heard the fabulous story from Mark. So to date, we've been able to help a little more than 100,000 people. We've been able to collect data on those so that we now have 120 million records that we constantly filter through to understand not just how to meet each patient where they are and move them to a better place, but also to understand fundamentally how patients learn. And so we're on a bit of a mission. We started in 2013. Here we are in 2020. Just launching today the latest rendition of this app that's a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more easy to use, a little bit more engaging, and collects a little bit more information so that we can make this better and better for the very next patient. So from my way of thinking, this is one of those examples of a smart and learning healthcare system that is patient-centered to the point where it gives them tools so that they can liberate recovery from being at a place to being wherever they are, whenever they can work on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.